I'm Ro.
And I'm Salem.
Let's dive into the Scaryverse. Hey, spooky besties. Welcome to Scaryverse, the podcast where horror isn't just about the scares. It's about the feelings, the stories, and the eerie comfort we find in the darkness. I'm Ro, your host, and today I'm diving into something that might sound a little odd, but is incredibly relatable for many of us: comfort horror movies. I know. Horror movies and comfort, isn't that an odd combo? But if you've ever reached for your favorite slasher film when you've had a rough day, or found peace in the chilling scenes of a classic haunted house, then you've probably got a comfort horror movie of your own. And today, I'm talking about mine, the movie that forever changed how I look at horror movies and how I looked at life. Let me set the scene. It was 1996 and I was 11 years old. I grew up in a small town where movie nights with my dad were a big deal. And my dad, being a single parent, tried his best to stay cool. So one Friday night, he said, "Hey, how about we go see this movie called Scream? It looks like a comedy." I don't think that at the time I knew what Scream was. I don't remember knowing what it was anyway. I just knew it had this killer mask and people were running for their lives. I didn't think it would be as scary as it was. My dad, on the other hand, thought it was just some slapstick, spooky comedy, I'm pretty sure. I don't blame him. That marketing campaign definitely tricked everyone into thinking it was just another teen slasher with laughs. However, when I talked about Scream being my favorite horror movie of all time in the first episode of this podcast, my dad caught up on the podcast and listened to all of the episodes. And he called me afterwards and was like, "I don't know what you're talking about. Scream is a comedy." So he clearly is still clinging to that belief. Fast forward to us at the theater, sitting in the dark. As the movie started, I remember the opening scene with Drew Barrymore. She gets the phone call, and at first it felt like a prank, but then things took a turn and the fear set in. That opening phone call, you know the one, where Ghostface is taunting her, asking her questions about horror movies. I felt the tension building, my heart racing, but I couldn't look away. And my dad, the one who thought it was a comedy, I'm pretty sure he was getting uncomfortable next to me, shifting in his seat. When Drew Barrymore's character got killed off, it hit hard. It still does to this day when I rewatch it. I remember looking at my dad, and I don't think we talked during the movie. I don't really remember, but I'm pretty sure he was thinking, "What did I bring my kid to?" But for me, I couldn't stop watching. There was something so exhilarating about how it twisted everything I thought I knew about the genre. The horror wasn't just about the scares, it was about the unexpected, and I loved every moment of it. And before you start judging my dad for bringing his 11-year-old child to see Scream in the movie theater, in his defense, I was avidly reading Goosebumps, and my favorite movie was Hocus Pocus. And I was obsessed with Halloween, witches, and ghosts, all of the creepy things. So I'm pretty sure he just thought it would be fine. But I do know, I'm pretty sure he told me after I recorded the first episode of this podcast that one of the reasons why he took me to see it is because we had gone to see several movies that were like rated G or PG in the movie theater. He noticed a trend of parents allowing their children to kind of interrupt the movie and run up and down the aisles screaming and yelling. It was just so annoying after you've paid for a movie. I'm sure some of you can relate. If you've been to the movie theater recently, it seems like there's this large influx of teens in the theaters, of people on their cell phones throughout the movie. It's really distracting. And when you've paid to see a movie, you want to actually see the movie. Well, he discovered that there were a lot less people going to see rated R movies. So anyway, now let's break this down. Why Scream? Sure, it's a slasher movie. But for me, Scream became a comfort movie because it blended the familiar with the unpredictable. You've got the classic horror movie tropes: the creepy phone call, the masked killer, the blood, the terror. But then it flipped the script and made fun of those same tropes. It was a meta horror movie before that was even a thing. It's also about survival. And maybe that's why I feel this deep, strange comfort in it. The characters in Scream are constantly fighting for their lives. They're smart, resourceful, and even in the face of death, they're figuring out how to escape, and so are we. We're learning how to survive, how to face our fears head on. In a weird way, that survival story is comforting. Here's where it gets deeper. Psychologically, horror movies, especially the ones we return to over and over again, help us process fear. It's like training for real life anxieties. When we watch characters go through intense situations, we're rehearsing our own responses to fear. It's like an emotional workout. And Scream offers just the right level of scary. It's intense, but it's not too real. It's just enough to help us process those feelings without overwhelming us. A 2017 study by the University of Westminster found that horror movies can reduce anxiety in some people by allowing them to experience controlled fear. It's like facing a danger that you know isn't real, and that can be oddly comforting when you're dealing with your own stresses or fears. Especially for me, as somebody who has ADHD and anxiety, I think horror movies do more to help me than to hinder me. And I feel like sometimes you just need to experience things in the comfort of your own home. So, why do we watch horror movies for comfort? Here's where things get really interesting. Comfort movies, no matter the genre, have one thing in common. They create a sense of familiarity. They offer us an escape to a place we can control, even if that place is a haunted house or a bloody murder scene. Think about it. When you're watching a movie like Scream, there are rules. You know the killer will follow certain patterns. You know the characters will go through phases of fear, but you also know in the end, someone's going to survive. I think specifically this is a huge theme in the movie Scream because you have Randy, who is the movie buff, and he knows every horror movie, and he's constantly quoting the horror movies and saying, okay, well, this is what happens in this horror movie. And here's all of the horror tropes that our killer is following. So here are the rules for survival. Here's how you survive a scary movie. We're living in a scary movie. Here's how you survive it. And his rules, I remember looking back on those and applying them to every horror movie I've watched and wondering to myself, is this horror movie going to break those rules, or is it going to follow that kind of formula? I always think it's fun when it breaks the rules a little bit. I reached out to the Scaryverse community this week asking you all what your favorite comfort horror movie is. Here are some of the responses that really stuck with me. Listener 1 is Sarah from Ohio. She says, for me, it's The Conjuring. I know that sounds weird, but the way it builds tension and then releases it feels like a cleansing. It's like purging all the bad energy. I watched it so many times, it's like a ritual now. And Michael from Texas says, I grew up with The Nightmare Before Christmas. I know it's not a traditional horror movie, but it brings back memories of childhood Halloween nights. It's comfort because it reminds me of being young, not having a care in the world, and just loving spooky things. And one of our show favorites, the mind behind our logo and some of the cover art for our episodes, is Fat Cow Cartoons on Instagram. And she said her favorite comfort horror movie is Midsummer. And I can totally see why. It's got all of the bright colors and it's taking place during sunshiny days. It's not dark and eerie and depressing, but it allows you to think through a lot of not so traditional horror tropes. See, this is the thing. There's a psychological component to why we love comfort horror. When we rewatch these films, we are actually confronting our own internal fears in a safe space. In a way, we control our fear. We know exactly what's going to happen, and we can predict the jumps, the scares, the twists. It's safe even when it's terrifying, and that's why it can be comforting. We know the rules, and even though we're scared, we're in control of the experience. The world around us might feel chaotic, but when we pop on that movie we love, we return to something that feels solid. You can take breaks from horror movies. You can press pause. You know that it's not going to go further than the screen in front of you. You're not immersed into an immersive experience of fear. So you're able to experience fear in a setting in which you're also allowed to be comfortable. And I almost feel like it's training our brains to not have that extreme of a reaction when we're actually scared, so that our bodies don't go into such a fight or flight mode, and we're actually able to remove ourselves from real life scary situations. Now, let's deep dive into something I find absolutely fascinating. Why do we love being scared? Why do we line up to watch horror movies knowing full well they'll make us jump, our hearts race, and our nerves tingle? It seems counterintuitive, right? Fear is uncomfortable, so why would we willingly subject ourselves to it? Let's take a look at the psychology behind horror, and not just why we watch horror, but also why we enjoy it. Horror movies trigger a primal response in us. We're wired to fear things because fear is essential to survival. It heightens our senses and prepares us to fight or flee. In fact, fear is a natural response to danger, a protective mechanism that's built into the human brain. But what happens when fear is controlled and doesn't actually pose any real threat? It turns out we might actually like it, even when there's no real danger. Psychologist Dr. Glenn D. Walters, in his 2017 study titled Why Horror Works, explores the idea that horror films give us the opportunity to engage with fear in a controlled environment. When we know we are safe, sitting in our living rooms, watching on a screen, we can explore these feelings without real-world consequences. This controlled environment is what makes horror exciting. We get the physiological rush of fear without any of the danger. Here's where it gets interesting. There are several reasons why we might enjoy the thrill of a horror movie. Let's start with the dopamine factor. Dopamine and the pleasure of fear, when we experience something that scares us, like a jump scare or a tense scene, our body produces dopamine, the feel-good chemical. Dopamine is released as part of the fight or flight response. But here's the twist. When the danger turns out to be fake, like the horror movie killer we know is just a character, the dopamine gives us a rush of pleasure and relief. That relief is a key part of the enjoyment. Our anxiety peaks and then drops. In a 2013 study published in the journal Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts, researchers found that fear itself can lead to pleasurable responses in some individuals due to this combination of arousal and subsequent relief. The researchers explained that the brain doesn't differentiate between actual fear and induced fear in safe environments. It's all processed the same way. But in horror movies, we get to feel that surge of adrenaline and dopamine without actual danger. The arousal theory of fear states the theory here is that humans thrive on arousal. In psychological terms, arousal refers to heightened states of excitement or energy. When you watch a horror movie, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure rises, and your senses are heightened. These physiological changes are the same as what happens in any stressful or exciting situation. But once the threat passes and we realize we're safe, the body cools down and we're left with a sense of accomplishment and excitement. It's a catharsis, a release of pent-up tension. This idea aligns with the arousal transfer theory, which suggests that the emotional intensity of a scary movie is transferred into other feelings like joy or relief once the fear subsides. Essentially, we enjoy the ride of anxiety because it gets replaced by relief and satisfaction, giving us a thrill that is enjoyable in its own right. Now, let's think about how this plays into the comfort aspect. If we're not actually in danger, why do these films still give us comfort? That's because horror movies offer us a controlled exposure to fear, which provides a safe way to confront anxieties that we may not always be able to face in the real world. Dr. Matthias Claesen, a psychologist and researcher from Aarhus University in Denmark, I have no idea if I pronounced that right, sorry if I didn't, suggests that horror films provide exposure therapy or therapy in a non-threatening way. Exposure therapy is often used to treat anxiety and phobias by gradually exposing individuals to what they fear in controlled settings. By watching horror movies, we can confront fears like death, danger, and the unknown. but in a way that allows us to safely process these emotions. In a sense, horror movies provide a type of emotional training. We learn to face discomfort and embrace fear in a safe space, which can help us deal with real life anxieties more effectively. That's why watching Scream or The Conjuring might feel like more than just entertainment. It's a chance to practice dealing with fear and then feeling victorious over it. It might sound counterintuitive, but playing with fear in the form of horror movies can have significant psychological benefits. Fear is often seen as a negative emotion, but it can actually lead to emotional resilience. When we face fear on screen, we are mentally preparing ourselves to handle real life challenges. We practice overcoming discomfort in a controlled, non-threatening way, which can increase our emotional strength. In a 2015 article published in Psychology Today, Dr. David J. Hufford explains that horror movies can act as a psychological gym where we practice emotional regulation. They offer a safe space to experience distressing emotions like fear and terror, but we leave the experience without any lasting harm. This repeated practice builds emotional stamina, much like how exercising builds physical stamina. That actually explains a whole lot because I read in another study that people who have ADHD, anxiety, PTSD, or trauma in their lives are more inclined to enjoy horror movies than people who don't. And the reason behind that is because of what we just heard about right here from Dr. David Hufford, that it helps to practice emotional regulation. A lot of those things can cause emotional dysregulation. And so people who are looking to regulate their emotions because they're trying to find ways to deal with those disorders, for lack of a better term, are more likely to enjoy horror movies. Horror movies are also cathartic. Catharsis refers to the emotional release we feel after going through an intense experience. While watching a horror film, we may experience anxiety, fear, and terror. But when the movie ends, we experience a sense of emotional relief, like a weight being lifted. It's a feeling of relieving tension, almost like a reset button for our emotions. This feeling of catharsis is often why horror lovers return to the same films repeatedly. The familiar scares are a way to consistently release tension and experience that emotional cleansing. Over time, this becomes a comforting ritual, something we can rely on when life feels chaotic or stressful. So, we've talked a lot about why we, the audience, enjoy fear. But why do people create horror movies in the first place? Why do filmmakers love to scare us? The simple answer is that horror taps into universal human fears and provides a way for audiences to face them head on. Filmmakers like Wes Craven, John Carpenter, and James Wan create horror movies because they understand the psychological power of fear. They know that horror movies can serve as both an emotional release for viewers and a reflection of society's deepest anxieties. Dr. Susan Blackmore, a British psychologist, argues that horror is particularly effective because it plays on our universal fears of death, the unknown, and the violation of the body. The power of horror lies in its ability to expose the darkest corners of human existence. Filmmakers create these movies not just to shock, but to give audiences an opportunity to process those fears and anxieties safely. At the end of the day, horror movies provide us with a chance to confront fear in a safe space, build resilience, and experience catharsis. We don't just watch them for the scares. We watch them because they teach us to deal with discomfort and to emerge victorious on the other side. In fact, it turns out that fear, when experienced in a controlled environment, can actually be good for us. It's no wonder that horror has become not just a genre, but a comfort. So, next time you curl up with your favorite slasher or ghost story, remember, you're not just escaping reality. You're confronting your fears, training your brain to cope with discomfort, and maybe even becoming stronger for it. Horror movies aren't just scary, they're emotionally enriching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you find comfort in horror? Why do you think horror movies have this power over us? Reach out to me on Instagram, TikTok, or drop a comment on our website. Until next time, stay spooky and remember, sometimes facing our fears is the bravest thing we can do.